After completing this lesson, you will be able to achieve these objectives. Define secure switching and ports. Describe common threats and attacks. Identify best practices for secure switching. Switches operate at the data link layer of the OSI model. They assign packets to VLANs based on the source MAC address of the packet frame. Switches store port information, including port capabilities, VLAN parameters, and the MAC addresses of devices connected to the switch, in a content addressable memory, or CAM table. Switches send frames to the ports of the corresponding switch. Without secure switching, switches can be vulnerable to any attacks at the data link layer.
Regarding the port inquiry for some courses, you want to take access.
While the CAM table allows for faster packet forwarding and fewer collisions, by default switches are prone to potential storms. Storms can flood a frame when it is a broadcast frame, unicast frame, or multicast frame, and the MAC address is not in the CAM table. To avoid a potential excessive traffic flood, switches can control the maximum number of broadcast, unknown unicast, and multicast packets sent per second on a port through a configurable threshold. Click the buttons for more information. An attacker can exploit the way a flood attack works to create a MAC flooding attack. Consider the example of a switch with one VLAN, 4 ports, and one entry in its CAM table related to the device C, with its MAC address C connected to port 3. Device C is compromised and starts sending frames with the MAC spoofing attack, which means that the frames are sourced from fake MAC addresses. This scenario shows this as E, F, and G. The switch receives these frames on port 3 and updates its CAM table with the corresponding fake MAC addresses. Once the switch CAM table is full, it is unable to learn additional MAC addresses and port mappings. Therefore, when device A sends a frame on port 1, its port mapping is not added to the CAM table because it is full of fake MAC addresses. The subsequent frame from device D to MAC address A is then not forwarded to port 1, but flooded to all the ports. The result is similar to a denial of service, a DOS attack, with the legitimate traffic disrupted by this flood. A second effect is that the compromised device C also receives sensitive information from all other devices, here from device D. Click on the buttons for more information. You can contain a MAC flooding attack by limiting the number of entries per port or VLAN. In the previous example, you could avoid attacks by limiting the number of entries per port to 1. Therefore, even if device C is compromised, the subsequent frames with the spoofed MAC addresses do not create additional entries in the CAM table, and the frames are dropped. When device A sends a frame, its MAC address A is added to the CAM table, allowing device D to get its frame directly forwarded to device A without flooding all the ports. In this example, the switch dynamically adds the MAC address entries for MAC addresses A and D. These dynamic MAC addresses are deleted automatically from the table after their expiry time. To enable stricter policies, you can enter MAC addresses statically. Therefore, with the previous limit of 1 entry per port, the switch can completely block the MAC spoofing and flooding attacks on a port. Since a static table may provide some constraints, you can also configure switches with sticky MAC addresses. In this case, the MAC address is learned on the port and its entry is not deleted, unless the switch is rebooted. Creating a stick MAC address removes the constraint of entering the static MAC address in the table. 802.1x authentication is another form of security that you can add to ensure secure switching. In this situation, the device must be authenticated before it can access the switch. Click the buttons for more information. The Best practices to secure switching and ports are: protect physical switches locally, for example, in a closet or restricted room. Switches are vulnerable LAN elements, and you must place them in a secure location. You must also restrict managing access with authentication, authorization, and a secure protocol, like SSH or HTTPS. Separate switches to enforce better physical segmentation. In particular, you should separate switches between internal and external networks so you can prevent them from being compromised at the same time. To limit a MAC flooding attack, restrict the number of MAC addresses allowed on a specific port. Configure sticky or static MAC addresses. This could reduce MAC spoofing. It also provides additional security by keeping a list of static MAC addresses list up to date in a dynamic environment. Use access control lists of verified MAC addresses to filter unverified addresses and prevent MAC flooding attacks. Add port authentication, such as IEEE 802.1x standard. Lastly, implement port mirroring to actively monitor port activity. You can also use port mirroring to obtain a trace of the monitored traffic.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm speaking to Mr. James. How are you, James, today? Okay, James, my name is Waleed and I'm calling you from Express Training Center. Should I WhatsApp you the details? Okay. I'm WhatsApping you the details, okay? Okay. Okay, you're busy. Okay, bye.
You've completed this lesson. You are now able to define secure switching and ports, describe common threats and attacks, identify best practices for secure switching and ports.